Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Nancy Sinkoff, Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life, Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers. I'm delighted to welcome you back to the second part of our mini course, Jewish Books in the Islamic World, from the Middle Ages until Modern Times. Tonight's session is called Jewish Printing in the 16th Century Ottoman Mediterranean. Just so you remember the ground rules, we are requiring all of you to be muted during the class. If you have questions, and I hope you will, please put them in the chat. And if there was a question perhaps that you asked last time that you want to build on, by all means, put it in the chat. And Dr. Noam Sienna, whose formal introduction I will give in a minute, will stop roughly 25 minutes into today's class to address questions that you have, then continue, and then we will have questions at the end. Closed captions are available for you. They are very helpful sometimes with foreign words. They are often very odd, but by all means use them. And you click on the captions or on the three dots to enable them on your screen. This mini course, including last week's session, is being recorded, and you will be able to review it or share it or direct people to the website of the Bildner Center if you want to learn more, if you want to, get a more in-depth experience than just listening tonight. It is my incredible pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Noam Sienna. Last week was a little dicey for me with the Verizon outage. Dr. Noam Sienna is the Bildner Center's Jerome and Lorraine Aresti Visiting Scholar for this semester, for the spring 2026. And I just want to underscore for many of you to understand that we are able, the Bildner Center is able to work with, appoint people like Dr. Sienna, who brings such wealth of information, creativity, and scholarly excellence to the Rutgers community because of these endowed visiting scholarship. This is part of what the Bildner Center has been able to do, and this is just to emphasize that these things happen because people were generous and made them happen here at Rutgers. So this is the second part of the mini course. I've mentioned that already, Jewish Books in the Islamic World. And Dr. Sienna is not only a scholar of Jewish books, he is the author, most recently, of a book called Jewish Books in North Africa, Between the Early Modern and Modern Worlds. It was published by Indiana University Press. And he is also at work now on a second manuscript on the study of the first Hebrew press in the Ottoman Empire, which, by the way, for all of you, you should really understand something very fundamental here, was that when Jews lived in the Ottoman world under Islam, they lived vital creative lives and could engage with Jewish printing, that is Hebrew printing and Judeo-Arabic and other things. So the culture of today, where we imagine this kind of intrinsic hostility between the world of Islam and the world of Judaism, is not true of the pre-modern period at all, and even well into the 19th century. That's just a little hop on my part. Dr. Sienna is not only a scholar, however, he is also an artist in many, many genres. He's a book artist, he is a paper maker, he's a letterpress artist, he is a scribe, and he combines his artistic insights into his study of the Jewish book. So there's a synergy between his artistic self and his scholarly self, which is something we're so happy to have at Rutgers. This semester, one of the things that he's doing is that he is working with the Rutgers Initiative for the Book and the Scarlet Letterpress in the English department, making prints with students, making papers with students, making classroom visits. So I'm just so delighted to have him here. And now I will turn the screen and the floor over to Dr. Noam Sienna. Thank you all for attending.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining me, and welcome back to those of you who were with us last week, and welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. I will repeat from last time my deep expressions of gratitude to Dr. Sinkoff for the invitation, for that very generous encomium of an introduction, and to the Bildner Center for the opportunity to share my work with you, to share my work with the Rutgers community. I've already had so many wonderful meetings and ideas for programming, and I'm really looking forward to diving in this semester and having the really energy and synergy come to life. So thank you to the Bildner Center. Thank you to Karen and Robin for their support and assistance in this first week as I get set up. As a reminder, this course is an exploration of Jewish life in the Islamic world through the lens of book history. So the format is going to be the same. We're going to have some talk now, break, and then the second half of the session. And I'll start with a little bit of a reminder, review for those of you who were here last week, which is that last week we started by defining book history as a field of study that focuses on the book itself as an object, not just a vehicle for text, combining the three methodologies that you see illustrated in this triangle: history, focusing on a book's context, literature, focusing on its content, and bibliography, focusing on the physical and material processes that produce it. So our goal in this course is to use book history as a window into these moments, critical moments for Jewish life in the Islamic world. Last week we spoke about Maimonides, the Cairo Geniza, and the golden age of medieval Islam. Tonight we are going to talk about the expulsion from Spain and the creation of the Sephardi diaspora in the Islamic Mediterranean in the Ottoman Empire. And finally, next week, we will explore the development of the Jewish Enlightenment and all the questions of modernity the Jewish communities faced in the 19th century with the promotion of Judeo-Arabic literature and Jewish printing in the 19th century. So for our task for tonight, the printing in the first years of the Sephardi diaspora, before we get there to that specific case study that I want to look at with you, we have two pieces of background that we need to cover. The first is the technological innovation of movable type printing, which is going to play a very significant role in how Sephardi Jews make and use books in the 16th century. And second, we need to talk about the historical background leading up to the expulsion itself. So I imagine that many of you are familiar with the figure of Johannes Gutenberg. And if I were to stop you on the street and ask what he was famous for, I would probably get the answer that he invented the printing press. That is not quite the case. Both the technique of relief printing and the mechanics of a screw press had existed already long before Gutenberg. If Gutenberg really invented anything, which is probably overstating the case, what he invented was a process not for printing per se, but for casting, which is to say, for casting many identical, reusable metal letters that could be arranged and rearranged to print an infinite number of texts. In short, what we call movable type. Within a few decades, this technology was being used across Europe in the production of books in over a dozen languages, including Latin, Greek, French, German, Italian, English, Dutch, Old Church Slavonic, and, of course, most interestingly for our purposes, Hebrew. These books, meaning any books printed during the first century of printing from 1450 until 1500, are called incunabula, or incunables, from the Latin word for cradle. These are books from the cradle of printing, books at the very early baby period of the history of print. So Hebrew incunabula, Hebrew books printed before 1500, appear not long after Gutenberg, who was working in the 1450s. There were Hebrew books being printed in Rome already in the 1470s, although we don't know exactly what the first printed Hebrew book was or when it was printed, because the earliest examples lack colophons, which are short texts that give information on the printing and the date, appearing at the end of the book, in the exact same place where a scribe would have traditionally signed a medieval manuscript. Title pages, which is where we normally expect the information about the book to appear, don't make an appearance in Hebrew books until around 1505. So it's a slightly later development. By the year 1500, about 150 different Jewish books had already been printed across Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And you see 3 examples here. These included Bibles and biblical commentaries, rabbinic literature, and works of philosophy, liturgy, and halakha, or Jewish law. Printing during the 15th and 16th centuries was hard work. So we're going to use this image of a 16th century printing house, not a Jewish printing house, but the process is essentially the same, to walk through the steps of how to produce a printed book. The first step, which you see illustrated on the left here, is typesetting, beginning with what's called casting off, estimating how many pages the printed book is going to be and how much text will go on each page. Then the compositors, or typesetters, go through a copy of the manuscript and set the text in type by hand, of course, page by page, letter by letter, and of course they're doing everything backwards. Once the text, so there's the typesetter. Once the text for a page was set, the whole bundle of type, which is called a form, F-O-R-M-E, was locked into a frame and ready for its first impression. The forms were handed to the pressman, who inked them by rubbing them, or technically speaking, beating them with the tools that you see illustrated in this image, ink balls, which are leather stuffed with wool wrapped around a wooden handle. Once the forms were inked, a sheet of paper was pinned between 2 parts of the press, which are called the tympan and the frisket. This was folded over so that the paper lay just on top of the inked type. The bed was slid underneath this large wooden block illustrated here, and the lever was pulled across, pushing the platen, as it's called, down, and voila, a printed page. This type of press, which is called a screw press or a hand press, was used for about 350 years unchanged, from the time of Gutenberg basically until the early 19th century. So after the first pull, the printed sheet was taken off the press bed and handed to the corrector. The corrector checked the printed page letter by letter against the manuscript copy. This was an essential step in the process to weed out the many errors that had been introduced during the typesetting process. Most presses ran each page through to be checked and corrected 3 times before signing off on the print run. Finally, when it was ready to print, the corrected forms would go back to the pressman for the full printing run, and the finished pages were hung up to dry before being gathered, arranged in the right order, folded, and sent off to be bound, while the finished forms went back to the compositors to be cleaned and redistributed. The type could be redistributed for the next page run. That's the whole process in a nutshell. A small professional print house with 1 press and a team of 2 pressmen and 2 compositors would aim to produce somewhere around 2,000 page impressions per day, which works out to about 1 page being printed every 15 seconds. One important feature of this early period is the movement of printers and printing techniques, especially as Jews, in the Jewish world, as Jews traveled to Western Europe to learn this new art and then bring it back to their home territories. The famed Soncino family, or Soncino family of printers, was originally from Germany, but they established a Hebrew press in the Italian city of Soncino in 1483 and took the name. They later migrated across Italy. You see here a book that they printed in Rimini, and eventually into the Ottoman Empire until the end of the 16th century. You also might be familiar with a current book publisher called the Soncino Press. They published a well-known Chumash. That press was founded in London in 1929. It's named after the Soncino family, but it has no relation to it. Another one of the first Hebrew printers in Italy, a man named Avraham Konat, was originally from Provence, but he operated a press in Mantua alongside his wife, Estelina. She is actually the first woman of any kind, Jewish or non-Jewish, who is known to have been involved in printing a book. In this colophon, which you see illustrated on the right, she says, Anochi Estelina katavti zot ha'igeret. I wrote this book, since there was still no specialized Hebrew term for printing at this time. The Hebrew word diffus, originally a Mishnaic term meaning form or frame, was first used for printing in 1477. Another common term used in this period was the term chakika, which literally means engraving, but that eventually dropped out of use. And of course, if you know modern Hebrew, you know that diffus is still the word for printing used today. Over the course of the 16th century, Hebrew printing spread throughout northern, central, and eastern Europe and across the Ottoman Empire, as we'll talk about in a moment, although Italy remained one of the foremost centers of Hebrew printing well into the 19th century. In all of these places, the sacred work of print continued to transform the relationships that Jews had with texts and books, as we'll see. But before we get to the case of Sephardim in the Ottoman Empire, let's rewind and see what's happening with the Jews of Sfarad in the Iberian Peninsula. We encountered Sfarad, or Al-Andalus, last week as the birthplace of Maimonides, the land of Sfarad under Islamic rule. However, the tide had turned in the 11th century, and the Christian kingdoms of the north became increasingly aggressive in their campaign to conquer, or in their minds, reconquer, and unite the entirety of the peninsula under Christian rule, a process they called the Reconquista. By the end of the 13th century, there was only one Islamic kingdom left on the peninsula, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, which you see illustrated on the map. In Christian Iberia, Muslim and Jewish communities were becoming increasingly unwelcome over the course of the 1300s and 1400s, despite their important economic and cultural contributions. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-1300s, inspired waves of anti-Jewish persecution. Christian religious leaders, especially the Dominican and Franciscan orders, became more and more confrontational in their demands for mass conversion and what they saw as the purification of Iberian Christianity. Outbreaks of mob violence against Muslims and Jews became commonplace, and by the turn of the 15th century, more and more Jews and Muslims had started converting or being converted to Christianity, becoming known as conversos and moriscos, respectively. In 1469, the Queen of Castile-Leon, Isabella I, married the King of Aragon, Ferdinand II, uniting the two largest Christian kingdoms of Iberia and creating essentially what is now the modern country of Spain. And here's Isabella, and here's Ferdinand. Ferdinand and Isabella were deeply concerned with unifying the peninsula, not only politically, but religiously. And in 1478, they petitioned the Pope to establish the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Spain. The Inquisition, led by a Dominican friar named Tomás de Torquemada, himself of Converso ancestry, attempted to find and punish any new Christians continuing to adhere to their old religion or beginning to fall back into it. In 1482, Ferdinand and Isabella began a war against the Muslim Kingdom of Granada, which lasted for a decade of bitter fighting, and finally, in January 1492, the last Nasrid emir, Muhammad XII, surrendered the city to the Castilian forces and departed for North Africa, bringing the Age of Al-Andalus to an official end. When Ferdinand and Isabella took Granada, the Treaty of Surrender had stipulated that Muslims and Jews would be permitted to remain in the city and were guaranteed their property and religious liberty. But soon afterwards, the Catholic monarchs, under the influence of Torquemada, changed their minds. In March 1492, they issued a royal proclamation known as the Alhambra Edict, which you can read here. It declares that all Jews in Spain had 4 months to either convert to Christianity or sell their property and leave the country, never to return, on pain of death. The majority of Jews prepared to leave. Many fled over the western border to Portugal, although that was not a safe haven for long, since Ferdinand and Isabella convinced the Portuguese rulers to follow their example, and they expelled their Jews in 1497. The Sephardi Jews scattered to a number of destinations, as we'll see in a moment. Scholars have argued for years about the exact numbers of how many Jews left Iberia, how many Jews stayed and converted, how many conversos returned to Judaism. Somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000 stayed, and roughly the same number converted. So that's a very wide ballpark, but roughly half the Jews of Iberia left and half chose to stay. So the ones who left, where did they go? And many, I should say, many of the ones who stayed ended up leaving 2 or 3 generations later. But the ones who left in the years immediately following 1492, where did they go? Over the first few decades of the 1500s, many Sephardi Jews chose to hop across the Straits of Gibraltar and head to North Africa. There were already large Jewish communities there, and the Iberian exiles joined them, although in most places maintaining their own distinct identity as Sephardim, or as they would say, Megorashim, the exiles. Other Sephardim went to Italy or into Northern Europe. Some took the long journey across the Atlantic to look for new homes in the European colonies in the Americas. But the major portion of the Sephardi exiles of the early years of the 16th century went east into the newly expanding Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans began as a Turkic tribe from Central Asia who had settled in Anatolia after the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. Over the course of the 1300s, they laid the foundations of an empire in northwestern Anatolia and rapidly expanded over the next century. In 1453, after a 2-month siege, Constantinople became the prize jewel in the Ottoman crown as the Byzantine Empire came to its official end. And by 1600, the Ottoman Empire straddled both sides of the Mediterranean and stretched far eastward into Central Asia and northward as far as modern Ukraine. The Ottoman Sultan at the time of the expulsion from Spain, named Bayezid II, is famously, although certainly apocryphally, reported to have said, "What a fool the king of Spain is to have so impoverished his kingdom while enriching mine." It's a nice sentiment, but it only appears for the first time in a historical chronicle of the 16th century, who probably made it up. The Ottoman Sephardim settled in urban centers like Cairo, Aleppo, Sarajevo, which is today in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Smyrna, which is today the city of Izmir in Turkey, and most importantly, the capital city of Constantinople, today Istanbul, and Salonika, which is today the city of Thessaloniki in Greece. Salonika was home to the largest Sephardic Jewish community in the early modern world, representing, at the beginning of the 1600s, an astonishing 68% of the city's population. By comparison, New York City today, which has the largest urban Jewish community in the world outside Israel and is thought by many to be the most Jewish city in the world, is only around 13% Jewish, so only about as fifth as Jewish as Salonika. But we're going to leave Salonika aside and in this session focus on the Jews of Istanbul, and in particular on a printing house that was established there in 1493. So that's going to be our task for the remainder of tonight. But before we get there, we'll take a quick break. Feel free to grab some water or stretch, and I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have on this background material before we jump into.
So, can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, my view is a little strange. Let me just put it back. So one of the questions, can you clarify this word incubulia? Is it just a chronological term that anything printed before X is called that? Why do scholars hold on to it? Or is it just that kind of scholarly, let's come up with an esoteric word that other people don't understand? I mean, what did it, because I've always been struck with it, some of the, or words like colophone, like,
Right.
is it significant or is it merely chronological?
It's a great question. And it actually is something that, as we'll see in a moment, really relates quite directly to the material that we're talking about. The term incunable or incunabula, technically it would be 1 incunabulum and 2 incunabula, or if you want to anglicize it, just incunables. It is originally a chronological definition. Any book printed before January 1st, 1501 CE is an incunable. Any book printed after that date is not.
Okay, so why? Why is that?
So the idea is to separate in some way the books that were printed in the early, let's say, experimental phases of the technology of movable type printing from what happens in the 16th century as printing becomes standardized as and commercialized as a professional industry. So it is true that incunables share all kinds of experimental features that solidify in the post-incunable period. So things like, where do you put the page numbers, if you put page numbers at all? Or how do you organize the text on the page? Things like, do you put the title at the beginning of the book or at the end of the book? How do you deal with multiple colors? Now, obviously, there's no real material distinction between books printed in 1500 and books printed in 1501, or even really, for that matter, books printed in 1490 and books printed in 1510. This is a slow evolutionary process, and we have some presses that span the incunable, post-incunable period. Like in the Jewish context, the Sonsinos. The Sonsinos start printing in the 1480s, and they continue printing uninterruptedly well into the 1560s. So at what point do their books stop? You know, it's a continual process of evolution. And of course, in a Jewish context, this whole thing is extra silly because, of course, the year 1500 has no meaning in a Jewish context. Interestingly, what does have meaning in a Jewish context is, on the Jewish calendar, the Jewish century. So in Hebrew, in Gematria, the years are marked with letters. And so in the years that are marked by the Hebrew letter Resh, meaning 5201 until 5299, Resh or Resh Aleph until Resh Tzadi Tet.
Tet, right.
Right? That century we could call the Resh century, corresponds on the Gregorian calendar to 1440 to 1540, which actually quite neatly encapsulates the first century of printing. And there's actually a real shift, and this is like in my own work, there's a real shift that happens around the middle of the 16th century, technologically and materially. So in my work on Hebrew printing, like the press that I'm talking about operates from 1493 to 1530, which on the Gregorian calendar means that its first book is an incunable and its second book is not an incunable. But from the Jewish perspective, all of their books are printed in the century of Resh printing. So I'm thinking really about the Resh books as a sort of an internal chronological demarcation. But you're right that there's really very little, it's really an artificial distinction.
You know, it's very interesting because I mean, you know this, and I think, you know, we need to periodize things. We need to sort of
Of course.
give temporal categories for things, but it's completely just going back to, so it's really fascinating actually, because the divide between incunables and post is a periodization scheme that actually doesn't make sense when you tell time according to the Hebrew calendar. And as you noted, tell time with Hebrew letters that both have meaning because they're words and numerical value. And all Hebrew books and that's one of the reasons we can see the shift from a pre-modern to modern is when Hebrew books begin to have Gregorian dates for publication as opposed to using the Hebrew alphabet. So thank you. And the other comment, I want to make a comment for people who, I love that graphic of the printing house. In many ways, it's just what a print shop looks like today. You know, it has, I mean, where there are screw presses, there are compositors, there are people setting type, the way the inking is done. You know, it could be the Scarlet Letterpress, really. So
Yeah.
I was very happy to see that. I was
Yeah,
very happy to see
in
that.
many ways, these materials, you know, the basic mechanical processes of setting type, for example, is essentially, you know, when I set type at the Scarlet Letterpress, I'm engaged in almost exactly the same physical embodied practices as a print shop from 500 years ago. You know,
Yeah.
the real distinctions are the way the type is made in this period, and we have a lot to say about the manufacture of type, which is sort of getting into the weeds. But in this period, all type is hand cast, meaning
Yeah.
each piece of type, each letter is poured into a handheld mold with that has a little letter at the bottom and cast individually. The
Yeah.
type that we, even as letterpress printers today, the type that we use is cast on a machine. So
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
in the 19th century, the sort of industrial revolution mechanized the process of typecasting so that you have a machine that like spits out type, very quickly. But
Yeah.
in this period, but this is true from the 1400s basically until the end of the 1700s. And so this is sometimes called the hand press period, all the way from Gutenberg through Shakespeare, through Milton, through the King James Bible, through the Declaration of Independence. The press, the type, the manufacture of paper, all of these processes were more or less unchanged in terms of how the embodied labor, what the embodied labor was to actually create a book.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Thank you so much. Just last question. This is a lithograph, correct? What we're looking at?
I think this is a copperplate engraving. So
Okay.
this is a 16th, slightly later 16th century engraving of a printing house. We do have some very early images of a printing house, but I love this one because it's so detailed and you can really see all the
Oh,
different
yeah.
hustle
Yeah.
and bustle. And we know from descriptions that early modern printing houses were incredibly boisterous places. The workers were paid in beer. So they were drinking on the job. And so like by the end of the day, it was somewhat raucous. There are like this person, seems to me to be like a young child. And we know that children were involved in the printing house. In fact, one of the great Christian Hebrew printers of the 16th century, Christoph Plantin, boasts in a letter to one of his colleagues that his daughter, Magdalena, who's 12 years old, knows enough Greek and Hebrew to be able to serve as a corrector in the printing house. She doesn't know the languages to be able to read them, but she knows the alphabet well enough that she can take a printed page off the press, compare it to the manuscript, and circle any letters that have been mistaken or that are upside down. So you have to imagine the printing house is there are people running around carrying heavy trays of type. There's ink, there's pressing, there's paper, there's shouting, there's languages, multiple languages. There's children running around. There are women going in and out. It's an incredibly dynamic workspace. A lot of fun, also maybe very stressful, but
Right. So we have a question. I don't think you necessarily have to answer it now, but just pin it, which is about setting Arabic, where the letters are not, the characters are not one-on-one, so to
yeah.
speak. But
I'll
if you
just say,
want,
I'll say very quickly, it's a tremendous technical challenge. Um, uh, it's attempted in the 16th century. So some Christian printers in Rome try to print some Arabic books, but aesthetically they look very poor compared to the incredible sophistication of Arabic calligraphy and even just ordinary Arabic scribal. Like a professional scribe could write a book in Arabic, and it just blew printed Arabic out of the water. So even though Muslims and Christian Arabic-speaking Christians in the Islamic world encountered printed Arabic books already in the 16th century, they basically looked at them and said, no, thank you, we don't like these. And so it wasn't until much later in the 18th century that Arabic character printing really sort of gets started again. So there's this gap of several hundred years.
thank
And
you.
even
Great. So,
then,
yeah. I'm sorry.
even in the 18th century, it's not solved. This problem is not solved satisfactorily. Nobody really ever solves the problem of Arabic type. So digitally now, of course, you can do all kinds of things with fonts.
Right, right. Interesting. Okay, so thank you for the questions and thank you for responding. And we'll move on. And please, everyone, if you have other questions, do put them in the chat.
Totally, yeah. Keep the questions coming. And I'm actually just going to skip ahead now back to where we left off. Okay, so this takes us into the case study that I want to share with you, which comes out of my very current ongoing research. As you heard, I'm currently in the midst of preparing a monograph on the development of Sephardi printing in the decades after the expulsion from Spain through a microhistory of the Ibn Nachmias printing house, which operated in Istanbul from 1493 until 1530. It was the first, the longest lasting, the most productive, and I would argue the most important, although it was not the only, printing press established in the Mediterranean by Sephardi exiles. My study focuses on understanding the Ibn Nachmias printing house in the context of both early modern Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire and early modern print culture. I'm particularly interested in the material conditions of their work. Where did they obtain their paper, their type, their wood blocks? Who were their workers and what were their tasks in the print shop? Who bought their books and why? So I'll give you a little background to the press, and then I want to look at two examples with you that focus on the materiality of their work. So it starts with David and Shmuel ibn Nachmias, a pair of Sephardi brothers who we think had learnt to print in an Iberian Jewish press. We don't know anything about their lives in Spain, but it seems that they had apprenticed in one of the incunable presses of the 15th century. They were expelled in 1492 and apparently managed to take some typographic equipment with them, and we'll see exactly what in a moment. They spent a few months in Naples, but quickly moved on to the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, where they set up shop and finished printing their first book, as you see, on 13th of December, 1493. This is the Arba'at Turim, a comprehensive guide to Jewish law. This was not only the first Sephardi book printed after the expulsion from Spain, but the first book printed with movable type anywhere in the Islamic world, and therefore, your new vocabulary word of the day, the only incunable, as defined in the Western tradition, printed outside of Christian Europe. Over the first 3 decades of the 16th century, so from 1500 until 1530, 3 generations of the Ibn Nachmias family, as you see in the little family tree, and many of their collaborators and printers who worked with them, who are named, printed almost every major text of the Jewish bookshelf. They printed the Hebrew Bible on its own and with rabbinic commentaries, the Babylonian Talmud and its medieval commentaries, anthologies of midrashim from late antiquity, foundational legal codes of halacha, liturgical works including the Siddur and the Passover Haggadah. They also printed contemporary compositions of theology and exegesis, philosophy, works of history and folklore, practical manuals, and popular works in both Hebrew and Judeo-Spanish, the vernacular language of the Sephardi exiles, also known as Ladino. They even printed or began printing an ambitious, planned encyclopedia of all known domains of human wisdom, which was projected to take up 5 volumes, but unfortunately, they only ended up printing the first volume before apparently going out of business in 1530. So, and you see here some examples of the various books that they printed. So for the first example, I want to look at their perceptions of the advantages of print technology, focusing on their 1509 printing of a book called Sefer Halachot Harif, a summary of Talmudic law by the medieval Maghrebi rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, known as the Rif. So I'm just going to say the Rif, and that means the Sefer Halachot of Alfasi, which was printed in 1509, and you see what it looks like here. The printer's introductions and colophons to this book emphasize its practicality and utility. In fact, many of the books printed by the Ibn Nachmias press market themselves as providing, like the Rif, a comprehensive overview of Jewish practice, a compact summary of Jewish interpretation, a book that guides you with everything you need to know about the particular topic. This was, of course, no doubt necessary in the state of dislocation and reorganization that characterized the Sephardi community in this period. The idea that something might have previously required a large number of books were circumstances now inaccessible or unimaginable in the light of the libraries lost during the expulsion. One of the Rif's editors wrote that, quote, Anyone who comes to buy this book, a work of valuable light never before printed, will find that it contains everything necessary to know from the entire Talmud. In other words, if you wanted to learn the entire Talmud before, you would have had to acquire many, many books, but now you just need this one book. The fact that this book is printed, moreover, adds a degree of authenticity, of authority and prestige, which would have been incomprehensible even just a few decades earlier. Although Hebrew printing had been practiced in Iberia already before the expulsion, as we saw, it was only established in a handful of cities, and it only operated for maybe 10 or 15 years. So it's quite likely that most of the Sephardi exiles in Istanbul were encountering printed books here for the first time. So it's not surprising that in this community, printing was tied explicitly to their arrival and reconstitution in Istanbul. In 1505, for example, the Sephardi editor Avraham ibn Yaish wrote in his introduction to a new edition of the Chumash, and you see his introduction here, that, quote, "Since that day of the sudden and bitter expulsion from Spain, our books have disappeared from the chaos of destruction and the confusion of upheaval. But now," he continues, "God has called to two brothers, printers, to spread Torah among the Jewish people and restore a small portion of the innumerable books which have been lost and destroyed on land and at sea." So here, both the technology of printing and the settlement in Istanbul represent symbols of divine favor and the promise of Jewish continuity. Similarly, in the colophon to the 1509 Rif, its editor, another Sephardi exile named David ibn Yahya, and you may remember Joseph Sklutz talked about the Ibn Yahya family from last month. So David ibn Yahya wrote that, quote, "There is no need for other books for the one who holds this work of delight, for indeed the community took up the call to print this book and send it forth in quires, so that scholars may benefit those from among the exile of Spain, whose wisdom was lost and holy books burnt. And so we praise the one who has helped us reach this moment and led us here to the great city of Constantinople," etc., etc. And so here again, we see the same themes. The arrival in Constantinople and the technology of printing come together as a symbol of God's blessing. But I want to pick up on what might be a seemingly small material issue, which is that Ibn Yahya says that the community has been taken up the work to print this book and send it forth in quires. What does he mean by that? Relatedly, he also added after the colophon to this book a list of the order of the tractates, quote, "so that the binders do not get mixed up, for the tractates have been published not in their order." Lo kasidram. What does that mean? How could a book be published not in order? So we might think of printers as printing books, but the truth is that in the early modern period, printers did not print books. They printed sheets of paper. A quire, also known as a gathering or a signature, is a group of pages formed by folding a single printed sheet. It's then sewn together to form one section of a book. In this period, as I said, the printed sheets were produced by the printers. Those printed sheets were folded and collated, and then only later would be bound into the finished books. In this example that you see, the sheet is printed in quarto, meaning you have 4 pages on each side, pages 1, 4, 5, and 8 on the front, and then pages 2, 3, 6, and 7 on the back. And when folded, this would form a single quire of 4 double-sided pages, or eight pages of text. This quire would then be sent on with all of the finished quires of the book to the bookbinder, who would sew all the gatherings together, hopefully in the correct order, and then sell the books either directly to the customer or to a bookseller who would finish it. The Cairo Geniza, in fact, preserves several examples of unbound printed sheets from the Ibn Nachmias press in Constantinople, as well as other presses, which have clearly been sent to a binder or bookseller in Cairo. They were folded but not sewn, not cut, and never were incorporated into a finished bound volume. And you see one example here from the Geniza. These are called binder's waste. So these are sheets as they came off the press in Constantinople. However, what is unique about the Ibn Nachmias press is that it seems they developed the practice of selling books directly to their local customers in Istanbul, quire by quire, as they were printed. Readers could thus still benefit from these books, especially reference works like the Reef, in a piecemeal fashion, while the press benefited from the financial support that this practice enabled, especially in the production of long books that could take months or even years to complete. So this is not dissimilar from the practice, for example, later in the 18th and 19th centuries of serializing a novel, for example, in the pages of a newspaper. Indeed, we have a fascinating, if slightly later, testimony to this process, thanks to a controversy around distributing these quires on Shabbat. So apparently, in 1546, there was a dispute between two rabbis in Istanbul about this practice vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbat. So this was recorded in a tshuva, or a rabbinic responsum, starting as follows. Ruvain, this is a pseudonym like John Doe, Ruvain has set his heart to printing some responsa, but the necessary expenses for the entire book are extensive. His solution is to sell some of the first already finished quires to the wealthy and noble members of the community and distribute them in the synagogue on Shabbat when the community has gathered for prayer. But some scholars oppose this practice for violating the laws of Shabbat. So what do we do? The response of the first rabbi, a Sephardi scholar named Shmuel ibn Hakim, is to declare that this practice has been done for as long as he has lived in Constantinople, since he first came to this land some 30 years ago, he writes. And indeed, he names two specific books printed by the Ibn Nachmias press back in the 1510s that he remembers being distributed in this way with no issue. In fact, even though he doesn't mention this, we know that Ibn Hakim himself, at the time of writing this, was working as an editor for two books of responsa, which were being printed in Istanbul. One was printed in 1545 and another came out in 1548. So he was intimately familiar with the printing process. So maybe that explains why he's taking the side of the printers here. He explains that there's no problem with business being done on the Sabbath because these patrons are not actually buying the book on the Sabbath. Rather, the intention of the buyers is for the entirety of the completed book, which has not even yet been printed. This practice, he argues, is essential for supporting the important work of these printers, without which they would be unable to print books at all. For not everyone is like Daniel Bomberg, he writes, name-dropping the famous Venetian non-Jewish printer of Hebrew books, who can print books and leave them in stock for year after year until the buyer arrives. In other words, unlike Bomberg, who could depend on the long-term presence of an audience of European scholars and humanists, both Jewish and non-Jewish, the economic basis of publishing in Constantinople was much more contingent and rooted in the immediate local context of the Jewish community. But the argument was not finished. The copyist of this responsum added a dissenting opinion of a rabbi named Yitzchak ibn Lev, a Romaniot scholar, meaning from the Greek-speaking Jews of the Byzantine Empire, now under Ottoman rule, not a Sephardi. Ibn Lev writes that Ibn Hakim erred in claiming that assisting a printer is a merit, for the printers are not engaged in making books for the sake of Torah study, but because it is their business. And not only that, but they're using the importance of the value of Torah study to appeal to people's emotions, guilting them into subscribing to books that they don't need and that they will regret buying. For what will the public do with this book of responsa, he asks. They've bought it only from shame, against their will, and afterwards they will sell it at half price. He concludes that it would have been better for Ibn Hakim to occupy himself with Torah and leave the books in the corner and not get involved in this meaningless drivel. This dispute opens a window into the world that these books lived in. Was it, as Ibn Hakim claimed, a community of avid readers and Torah scholars eager for the latest collection of responsa hot off the press? Or was it, as Ibn Lev asserted, an uneducated and uninterested populace being taken advantage of by self-indulgent rabbis and unscrupulous business dealers? There's probably some truth in both positions. But in any case, what stands out to me is how the meaning of technology for the Ibn Nachmias press here centers around its relation to the needs and fears and internal dynamics of the local Jewish community. My final example now turns to a different aspect of their printing work, namely its material appearance. You may have noticed that the Ibn Nachmias press had a number of large woodblocks, which they used as decorative frames and title pages to open their books. We saw this one already in the printing of the Reef. Some of them, like the one that they used here for the Reef, actually originally came from Spain. So you can see on the left-hand side, this border in a printing from Ijar in Spain from 1486, and you can see the exact same border used in Istanbul in 1509. And so this is the physical block itself was carried from Spain to Constantinople, and we have several examples of this. However, by the end of the 1510s, it seems that these frames, which by this point were 30 years old, had started to wear down and needed to be replaced. It's at this point that a new group of decorative blocks starts to appear in the Istanbul printings, and you see them here. A set of 3 matching blocks, clearly carved for the purposes of book printing, in collaboration, obviously, with the Jewish printers, but they bear an unmistakable connection to local Ottoman crafts, and in particular to the art of the Ottoman court. The decoration of Ottoman art of the period was characterized by this exact style of foliate ornamentation with split palmette scrolls, if you want to be a technical art historian about it, a style called Rumi, which emerged in the late 15th century through a fusion of Arab, Byzantine, and Central Asian aesthetic motifs. These designs appear widely in late 15th and early 16th century Ottoman art produced at the court workshop on paper, leather, textiles, ceramics, stone, and metalwork. My colleague at Stanford, Patricia Blessing, has shown that court artisans produced paper templates with Rumi designs meant to be used for works in a variety of media. So it's possible that these woodblocks were themselves carved by Muslim artisans at the Ottoman court, or that Jewish printers acquired paper templates from the court workshop, and then they applied the Rumi designs to the woodblocks to carve and create these frames. But in either case, it seems clear to me that these books represent a distinct effort on the part of the Ibn Nachmias press to create a visual appearance for their books that is integrated into the contemporary Ottoman aesthetic that they saw around them in the material culture of their daily lives. Just 25 years after their arrival in the Ottoman Empire, we can already see here an indication of Ottoman acculturation and the Sephardi community's desire to represent itself as belonging to this place. In summary, the printing house of the Ibn Nachmias family drew on a trans-Mediterranean network, despite or perhaps because of the turbulent circumstances of its origin. Their workers came from a diversity of linguistic and cultural background. Most were exiled Iberian Sephardim from both Spain and Portugal and their children, but I've also identified press workers who were Provençal Jews, Romaniote Greek-speaking Jews, and at least 2 press workers who hailed from an Arabic-speaking milieu, probably from North Africa or Egypt or Syria. The books of this press took shape through additional collaboration with Muslim court artisans, with Venetian Christian paper merchants, and others, all thanks to the many networks that came together in Istanbul, a Mediterranean hub, a port city that provided a space of technological innovation, of cosmopolitan encounter, and of access to networks of capital, transportation, and labor. But as we contemplate the meanings of this unique 16th century Ottoman Jewish press, many questions remain. In what ways did their books take shape through the global movement of new technologies? And in what ways were they responding to the local Jewish and Islamic environments in which they were produced? I guess I'll have to roll up my sleeves and head over to the Scarlet Letterpress to see if I can find the answers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start with, in some ways, the last question, because it's a little direct, although maybe it's not. Justin Hornstein wants to know what is the Hebrew word for choir?
Okay, so the Hebrew word for okay. Um, so the, we have a big problem with vocabulary, which is, as I said, all of these words, all of everything in the print shop has a name, and this terminology is being developed in Christian Europe in one direction, and then Jews are kind of coming up with their own terms. So the Hebrew word that is used for choir is kuntres, which is a Talmudic word that originally meant something like notebook. And so sometimes when people say kuntres or kundres, sometimes they mean just a small book or booklet. But when they use it in a technical sense, I believe, and I think there's evidence to support this, that it refers specifically to what Christian printers call a gathering or signature. In other words, it's the little booklet that is sewn together to make up the parts of the book. Another example is the Hebrew word tsura, which literally just means like shape, right? But in the context of printers, I argue, and other scholars have argued, that it means form, not just form like F-O-R-M, but form F-O-R-M-E, meaning the block of type that's set and locked into a frame to produce a page is called in Hebrew, in early modern Hebrew, a tsura. And that, I think, I don't yet know to what extent Jewish printers are aware of the professional development of their Christian neighbors. And this is one of the questions that I'm trying to illustrate here, which is like in Italy, there's no question. Jewish printers and Christian printers are collaborating. The Sonsinos are working, Gershom Sonsino worked with Aldus Manutius. Like we know that they had relationships with Christian printers. In fact, in many places in Italy, Jewish printers had to work with Christian printers because they weren't allowed to own their own presses. But in the case of the Ottoman Empire, there were no other printers. There were no Christian printers. There were no Muslim printers. There weren't even any other Jewish printers, really. This family household and their workers were the only ones. So they're kind of like a little bubble on their own, and that's why I'm interested to try to see to what extent what they're doing, parallel to what other presses are doing, or to what extent are they experimenting on their own. But yeah, that was a long answer to a short question, which is the Hebrew word for choir is kuntras.
Thanks. So someone had a great sort of medical question. We talked about the beer drinking and there's no mechanization, so I don't think anyone's losing fingers and toes. But what about lead poisoning? Or what is the type made of? And what do we know about, I mean, today, well, I know in urban settings, you can't send a kid to school unless they get tested for lead
So
from paint. So what do we know about and not so much the sanitary, but the environmental problems of this technology, of
totally.
these technologies.
So so type is made from a metal alloy, which is largely but not entirely lead. So it's about 2/3 lead in this period. It's about 2/3 lead, and then about 1/3 tin, and a little antimony. And sometimes printers would throw in other little like iron nails or little like copper shavings or whatever other random metal they had lying around. But it's mostly, you need it to be soft enough that it will melt at a low temperature and pour very smoothly into this very little mold and fill all the spaces to get the exact shape of the letter. But it needs to be hard enough that once it's hardened, the letters are going to stand up to the pressure of the press and not get dented or bent. So the mix for that is the alloy. Probably the typecasting was actually being done in the printing house itself. By the end of the 16th century, typecasting had already become professionalized into a separate industry. But in this period, there would have been a little room off to so there's like a big room, which is where the printing happens. And there would have been a little room off to the side where somebody had a little furnace and a vat that sat over the furnace. And in that vat, there was molten metal. And they had a little ladle and a little hand mold. And they would sit there all day casting letters. sometimes like on commission, like the printer's like, hey, I just busted an olive. I need another olive stat. And then the typecaster has to get the olive mold and cast another olive. Um, so that typecaster is sitting over a vat, dealing with molten metal. So there are certainly some health hazards associated with that. But the truth is that the lead poisoning is actually not so much a concern for printers, because the metal that they're handling is in a stable, solid form. They're not ingesting it, and it's not airborne. It's like it's just hard metal.
It's a solid.
Solid.
It's a
So
liquid and a solid, but it's
yeah,
not airborne.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's not lead. The lead poisoning is not a concern, and I know contemporary printers. I know colleagues of mine who like get their lead tested every year, and it's flat. Like working with type does not increase your risk of lead exposure. The other major concerns are, as I said, like the drinking, but actually the biggest concern is fire. I mean, and this is true generally in the early modern period, but as I said, you have somebody sitting over a furnace, and then you have an entire room that's filled with paper and wood. And we know that many, many times somebody knocks over the furnace, or somebody, for whatever reason, a lantern, right? You think about people, if they're working late into the night, a candle gets knocked over and the entire printing house goes up in flames. And then we have like colophons and books that say, we'd printed the first 200 pages of this book, but then a fire broke out and the entire printing house burned down, and we had to start all over again and set the type and print the book from the beginning. So the fire was by far the number one enemy of printers in this period.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I think that we just we know about the dangers of fire, but it's a whole different thing when you're dealing with wood structures, paper, textiles. Yeah. Someone had a question about sort of the economics of it. Um, what do we know about patronage in terms of printing houses, printing books, and things like this? What do we know about that?
Um, they definitely had patrons. Many of these books, especially the larger books, printed on what's called a folio. So a quarto, right? You fold it, and each sheet of paper produces 8 pages. A folio, you just fold the paper once. So each sheet of paper just produces two double-sided pages. These are big, expensive books, and paper is very expensive. So a big folio book with, like the Reef, right? Hundreds of pages, or a Chumash, hundreds of pages. These are very expensive. And we know that, and so they often name, in the colophons, they name the patrons who gave, their money. And some of these patrons, we know who they are. So for example, one of the patrons is a man named Moshe Hamon, who is the doctor at the Ottoman court. He's the doctor of the Sultan. And actually his father was the doctor for the Sultan, and also his son is the doctor for the Sultan. The Hamon family is one of the very important families of Istanbul. We know another patron is a man named Sha'altiel Tzuri, who was the tax, it's called like a tax farmer. He is basically
Right. It's in tax farmers or tax collectors. Yeah.
right. He's a tax collector that delivers the Jewish communities, right? They're living under Islamic rule, so they have a special tax, what's called the poll tax, that exempts them from military service, that they pay directly to the Sultan. So Sha'altiel is responsible. So he's moving, massive amounts of money. So these very wealthy, there's also wealthy merchants, traders, people who are involved in doing business between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. Jews are the intermediaries in this period between the Ottoman Sultan and Italy or France. So all of these wealthy merchants and doctors and intellectuals are often sponsoring the production of these books. I think also the press has an economic, there's an economic game that they play, where some of their books sell very well and can be produced very quickly, but don't give them a lot of cultural, prestige. And then there are some books which are very fancy and impressive and sell for a lot of money, but they take a time and you might not sell very many. So you have to find the right balance. So for example, the Ibn Achmias press prints, they print Sidurim. They print little booklets of Bakashot. They print an illustrated Haggadah. They print popular books in Judeo-Spanish, folk tales. Like these are guaranteed sellers. They print a lot
Yeah.
of little booklets that are just one gathering, right? They just take one sheet of paper, print 8 pages on one side, 8 pages on the other side, fold it, sew it, and it's done, right? It doesn't, you don't even need multiple gatherings. Uh, so those little booklets are very popular, and that sustains the economic investment that they need to make to print something like the Reef, which is like, 450 folios and takes a year and a half to complete, and you have to buy all the paper in advance. Um, and so they're always playing that game, and probably at some point, I mean, they went out of business. Uh, Most printing presses in this period didn't last very long because this game is so precarious. You're economically, a printing house is like on the edge of a knife. One bad guess about what kind of book is going to sell, right? You've bought all the paper in advance for every copy of the book. So you print 500 copies of this luxury edition of, some rabbi's commentary on Genesis that you think is going to be a big hit, and nobody buys it. You've already paid for the paper. So you're now, and you've got a warehouse full of books. So you're sunk. And most printing presses, last, 10 or 15 years. The fact that these guys lasted almost 40 is really incredible, actually.
Okay, we have a lot of other questions, but I'm mindful of the time. So I will ask only one other question, and the chat you'll get if you want to address some of it later in next week. So someone is curious about why did the Ibn Nachmi's, this family, print in Arabic at all? They'd heard that Muslim writers, there was, competition between them, or wasn't there? What's the relationship of this press to Arabic printing?
Yeah, it's a great question. They do not print in Arabic at all. In fact, they do not print in any other characters other than Hebrew. They only have fonts for Hebrew. Of course, they print in other languages. They print in Judeo-Spanish, as I said, and they print a few. They print some words in Judeo-Arabic, but not actual. Excuse me, not actual books. I don't believe they print anything in Turkish language. But and they print a few things in Judeo-Greek also. But they don't print in Arabic script. Now, the question is why? One explanation would be that they weren't allowed to. And this is a hypothesis that has a lot of scholars behind it, who claim that there was some kind of ban on Arabic printing. The problem is we have no evidence for that. There's no source. This appears in European travelogues starting in the early 1600s, who say things like, there's no printing in the Ottoman Empire because the Sultan has banned all printed books from his realm. But we don't have any Ottoman sources that indicate that there was any kind of decree from the Sultan that banned print. Probably they didn't print anything in Arabic because the technological constraints were simply, as I said, too insurmountable. I don't think that these printers actually had the capacity to create a new font, meaning design a new typeface. They had the molds that they brought with them from Spain, and they just were casting more letters out of those old molds until the end of the 1520s. They did not, like, the letters are exactly the same. They don't have their own typeface that they design. So that means that I don't think they could cut their own molds, and so they even if they wanted to print in Arabic, I don't think they had the technical ability. And as I said, printing in Arabic is technically a very difficult challenge. And I think the other major reason is there wasn't a market. Arabic speakers or Turkish speakers, Muslims, did not want printed books in Arabic. The Italians tried it and they couldn't sell the books because nobody wanted them, partially because they were aesthetically unattractive, and partially because there was actually, it's true, there was a very well established, economic and even political, intellectual cohort of manuscript production. The whole ecosystem of paper makers, scribes, calligraphers, booksellers, the whole ecosystem was built around supporting manuscript production, and it was a very well-functioning system. My colleague Nir Shafir has written about this, about the information information economy in the early modern Ottoman Empire. You know, people, they were circulating news, there were pamphlets, but it was all in manuscript. There was this very robust culture of manuscript circulation, and print just would not have been able to get a foothold. So, but the Ibn Nahmias press, they strike me as somewhat insular. They were not, everything they were doing was aimed internally at the Jewish community. Their books were all, you know, for their own readership. They had an aesthetic relationship to the communities around them, but they were not interested in marketing books to them. I think it was very much an internal process.
Well, thank you. I think as you know, evidence of how many people are on the call, it's
Mm.
really, I think, helping people understand kind of what the history of the book does for us, how it helps us ask so many other questions by looking at these objects, and not just assuming, oh, they had books or oh, they had manuscripts, but it's a whole culture, a whole social milieu that's producing these different kinds of things. And very grateful for this class. There are other questions. You'll get to chat. You'll see if you want to address some of them next week. So on that, everyone, I'm sad to say that we only have one more class in this mini course, and that is next week, same time on Wednesday, Jewish Visions of Modernity in North Africa and the Levant. So moving out of the early modern period. And I also want to tell you that on February 9th, we have a very different topic, a virtual talk by Dr. Melissa Clapper, who earned her PhD at Rutgers, I'm happy to say, many years ago, and has been extremely productive as an American historian, American women's historian. And she has a forthcoming book on female travelers in the interwar period. And for us, she's giving a talk called Not Just a Pleasure Trip, American Jewish Women's Travel to Mandate Palestine in the early 20th century. So I hope you'll be able to come to that. That's Monday, February 9th at 7 o'clock. And we have an in-person lecture, excuse me, on March 23rd with my colleague in the history department, Dr. Jochen Helbeck, who is an expert in Soviet history and on World War II. He's written very important works on Stalingrad, as well as writing books on Soviet subjectivity, diaries and autobiographies of Soviet citizens. And his newest book is called World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews. And that's in person at the Douglas Student Center on Monday, March 23rd. And I hope I'll see you there. And I also want to thank the staff. Karen Small, Managing Director, Robin Auerbach, Program Coordinator, Darcy Marr, who does all our communications that help you know what we're doing at the Bildner Center. And always, I do have to emphasize that we are primarily self-supporting, and all of these free classes that we do and all these free lectures that we do, we're able to do because of your support, the public support. So I hope that you will always consider us when you think about your tzedakah or your charitable giving. And thank you, Dr. Noam, Sienna. Can't wait to see you next week. And I'll just give a little plug. One of the things that Dr. Sienna is doing a paper making workshop with students at Hillel in celebration of Tu B'Shvat, which is just another trick he has up his many multicolored sleeves. So I'm so happy
Know
about
any
that as
students?
well.
If you have any students, friends or family at Rutgers, please encourage them to come.
Please send them. Please send them to the
Tuesday,
paper making workshop.
or Save the
Yeah,
Trees. We're going to recycle paper and turn it into more paper so that we can save the trees for Tu B'Shvat. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all next week, next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
great. So good night and stay warm.